In this video, I'm going to cover Chapter 6, the cloud, and Chapter 8, social media. We'll talk about Chapter 6, the cloud, first. All right, so I am going to cover some highlights of Chapter 6 and 8. I'm not going to cover all the slides associated with those chapters. First, we're going to talk about why is the cloud the future for most organizations. Well, let's back up a little bit and first just talk about what is the cloud. So the official definition of the cloud is it's elastic leasing of pooled computer resources over the internet. So that might make a lot of sense to you, or maybe it doesn't make sense at all. Let's first talk about what we mean by elastic. And the definition elastic means you're essentially leasing computer resources. So we all know what lease means, right? So you lease a car instead of buying a car. You rent a house versus buying a house. So we're leasing computer equipment instead of purchasing it. And it enables us to increase or decrease those resources dynamically or maybe programmatically in a very short period of time. So historically, when organizations wanted to run any type of computer software, they had to purchase hardware in-house, whether it's mainframes, microcomputers, PCs, any kind of server, and they had to bring those and run those inside their organization. Usually people had a data center or computer room where they stored these, and if they needed more computing power, they had to buy more equipment. If they all of a sudden didn't need as much computing power, well, they were kind of stuck with it because they'd already bought the hardware. So the concept of the cloud is that you lease these resources over the internet. So these these devices are not physically located in your organization and you don't own them. You lease them over the internet, and that enables you to increase and decrease those resources very quickly. It gives you flexibility to meet unpredictable demand. So if you are a retail organization and your demand goes way up over the holidays, you can potentially increase your resources over the holidays, and then when January, February comes, you can tone it back down again. So what does it mean by pooled? Cloud resources are pooled, meaning that many different organizations share the same physical hardware through virtualization. So we talked about virtualization in one of our previous chapters, and if anyone here has used the Parallels environment through St. Louis University, that's a virtualized environment that you can use. So you essentially can log into the internet and access a Microsoft Windows machine. And so through virtualization, you could have 3, 5, 20 companies all using physically the same piece of hardware, but it's virtualized, so each company has what looks like their own computer server. The benefit is economies of scale. We kind of talked about that already because you can increase and decrease your hardware. And these major cloud vendors, Amazon is probably the one that most of us have probably heard of. They operate enormous web farms, and so there is lots of room for organizations to use them to scale up and scale down. So when we talk about the cloud, I talked about traditionally and what companies did traditionally, and that is referred to as in-house hosting. So in-house meaning you purchase the hardware and run it within your organization, and cloud is what we just talked about. So, what are some of the differences? So here's some of the positive things on cloud-based hosting versus in-house hosting. So cloud-based hosting has very small capital requirements, right? Because you don't actually have to buy any hardware. You can have speedy development because depending on if you're buying just the computer or computer resources or potentially the whole platform, you don't even have to install it. It enables you to grow, and there's a whole list of other positives there. On the in-house hosting side, the positive is that you do have control over the data location. So if you are using the cloud, you don't necessarily know physically where your data is located. It could be wherever Amazon's has it stored, which they have web farms all over the world. The other positive about in-house hosting is you have in-depth visibility of security and disaster preparedness. And so if you are using the cloud to host, you don't necessarily have as much visibility into that because you don't necessarily, I think Amazon and some of these vendors share some details about their security and their disaster preparedness, but probably not as much as you would have if you were hosting that in-house. All right, so why is cloud prevalent now? Well, the reality is it's been around since the 1960s. Yes, that is not a typo. It's actually been around since the 1960s, but just not really prevalent. So why is that? Well, there's some factors that have made it more recently more advantageous, and that is very cheap processors, data communication, storage are all much less expensive than they used to be. Virtualization technology. So until virtualization was really mature and able to do that type of thing very easily, it made the cloud not quite as appealing because companies couldn't necessarily share the same resources on a same physical device. And also internet-based standard has enabled cloud hosting vendors to provide flexibility yet in standardized ways. And so some of this really is also, I think, just companies getting used to the idea. I've worked for software companies for many, many years. And 10 years ago, when you talked about cloud computing, most organizations were not ready to jump on board with that. They were still very leery of that. They were very concerned about not having control over their data. And so some of that just took time for organizations to get used to that and adopt that type of technology. There are some instances where the cloud does not make sense. For example, if by law your company has to have physical control over the data, then you would need to do in-house hosting. That maybe a financial institution might need to legally maintain control over its data, and so that would be an example of when it does not make sense. So how do organizations use the cloud? So here's 3 types of cloud category that you might have heard of. Probably the most common one is SaaS, software as a service, and some examples of that are Salesforce.com, Google Grid, Microsoft SkyDrive, Office 365. Those are all, you are essentially leasing software to use. You don't own that software. I think a great example of that is easy to understand is if you think of Office 365. So it used to be if you had a Microsoft desktop or laptop and you wanted to use Word and Excel and PowerPoint, you actually had to physically go buy that software. You went to the store or you downloaded it and you got discs or DVDs or downloaded that software and you physically had to install it on your computer. And then you had, whatever version that was. You bought version 6, so then you had version 6 of that software. Well, now Microsoft Office offers Office 365, which is essentially leasing that software. You don't actually download it onto your computer anymore. You lease the software. So when you have an Office 365 license, usually I think the license that I have is I think it's up to either 5 or 10 users, and my household can have access to Word, Excel, PowerPoint. I think Access might be in there as well. I'm not sure. But I'm essentially leasing that software now. I pay, I don't remember what it is, $10 a month or something like that for Office 365. There's also PaaS, which is Platform as a Service. Microsoft Azure, Oracle On Demand are examples of that. So you are actually leasing the platform. So that's the platform that you run your computers on. And then infrastructure as a service are things like Amazon, the Elastic Cloud, Amazon S3. That is really purchasing the infrastructure. I shouldn't say purchasing, that's the wrong word, leasing the infrastructure. So the networking and all the hardware devices that you need to run in that environment. And so a lot of times what you're using is a combination of all of those. Now, if we take this down to your level, or the user, the average everyday home user, there's lots of cloud software that everybody uses now. I mean, I can't imagine anybody that's not using some type of cloud software. If you have an iPhone, you're probably using some type of cloud software. LinkedIn, that's an example of software as a service. Pretty much any app that you run on your phone would be an example of software as a service. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about the private cloud. So the private cloud is still run over an intranet, and it's using web services, but it is owned and operated by the organization for its own benefit. So it's not available publicly. So if you go to work for, some large company here in town, I'm going to take Centene. That's probably a good example. Centene probably has its own internal intranet where it runs different applications that people within that organization can use, but it's not available outside of Centene. So it's only available to employees and people internal to Centene. All right, so that pretty much wraps up the conversation around the cloud. The other thing that I wanted to mention is back up on the screen when it talked about advantages and disadvantages of running in the cloud, and it talked about a small capital expenditure for the cloud. The other thing that is very appealing to IT departments when it comes to the cloud is it's much easier to ask for, if you are going to run an application in the cloud, it's much easier to ask for a monthly budget of software than, let's say, a $4 million capital expense to go and buy all the hardware, to get all the networking available, to do all the installation of that software, to purchase the software and run that in-house. Sometimes that can be hard for a company to bite off because it can be very, very expensive. Alternatively, if you are doing software as a service, you're probably just paying monthly for it, and so it's not quite as expensive. So if you think about Office 365, the example that I gave, I pay $10 a month. That doesn't seem like too much. Before, when I had to go and purchase that software outright, sometimes it was $100, $200. Now you've probably figured out that obviously in the long run, that subscription model is much better for software companies, because if people have that software for 2, 5, 10 years, in the long term, they're actually paying more for it. But anyway, that's the model that most companies use now, is that subscription-based model. All right, so let's move on to Chapter 8, Social Media Information Systems. So I don't think I have to explain social media. At one point in time in this class, that probably had to happen, but everybody knows what social media is. And so what is a social media information system? Essentially, it is the use of IT, information technology, to support content sharing among networks of users. It enables communities of people related by a common interest, and it supports sharing of content among a network of users. When I read that, the first thing that comes to my mind is Facebook, because that's probably the most notorious social media outlet, and probably the first one where really people started thinking about these community of users, and there was a lot of content being shared. So Facebook is certainly one example of a social media information system. In a social media information system, you really see three different organization roles. You have your user communities, so that's on Facebook, that's us. And then on the right there, you have your social media sponsor. So those are all the ads you see plastered all over Facebook. And then down at the bottom, there's the social media application provider. And so that's the company that actually runs it. So Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Snapchat, those are all examples of social media information systems. All right, so we listed off some of those providers already, and there's the concept of those sponsors on those sites where you see those ads. So the sponsor may or may not pay a fee. That really depends on the application and what they do with it. Most of the ads that you see on sites like that, those companies are definitely paying for those ads. But if you think about on Facebook, you can create a company page. You know, all of us, probably most of us have a personal Facebook page, but if you're a company, you can create a company page on Facebook, and there's no charge to do that, but there is charges to advertise and other things that you might want to do with it, and depending on the type of posting and stuff that you have. All right, so most of you probably thought of this before, but you know, how do those companies make it? You know, I don't have to pay for Facebook. How does it make money? It's certainly not free. Someone has to develop, implement, and manage all the social networking that goes on there. There's a lot of direct labor costs for employees who contribute to it. So it's definitely not free, and certainly advertising is one of the ways that those companies are able to cover those costs. We're going to talk about this as it relates to social capital. So there are three types of business capital: physical, human, and social. So physical and human is something that you've probably talked about in other business classes. Physical capital is, you know, just what you use to produce your goods and service, your factories, your machines, equipment, things like that. Human capital are your people and the knowledge and the skills that those people have. And now there's this concept of social capital, and that's essentially the social relationships that a company has within a marketplace. And so you think of this, I mean, a lot of companies have pages on Facebook now, and they have a pretty big social media presence. And so there certainly is the perception that there's value that those companies can get through that social capital. So what is the value of social capital? Well, you know, that's the number of relationships you have. So it's the classic on Facebook: how many friends do you have? On LinkedIn, how many connections do you have, or how many followers do you have? And then what's the strength of those relationships? And then what's the information, the influence that those relationships can have to essentially increase the social capital of a company? I'm really amazed at how many companies have, you know, huge social media presence on sites that where I wouldn't expect it normally. On Instagram, you know, companies have Instagram accounts and they're posting things on Instagram. And it's really kind of mind-boggling to me that there's value in that, and that's increasing the social capital for those organizations. But there are people that are much more likely to respond to a company that way than through more traditional outlets. And I've covered this a little bit already. How do social networks add value to businesses? I just talked about that, how they have presence on these sites. They're encouraging customers and interested parties to leave comments. Interesting experience that I just had last week is there's a site out there called Capterra.com, it's kind of like Yelp where you do restaurant reviews, but it is geared just for software companies. And so software companies are trying to get people to go out there and review their company. Our company's trying to do that as well. That's how I became aware of it. But recently we were purchasing a software package for our company, and we were enticed that we could get a discount if we put a review on Capterra.com, because I had actually used that software before. So that's kind of how I got started doing reviews on there. And then I got this email the other day that said, you can get $25 for every review that you do. Well, my husband was actually kind of poking fun at me because that's out of character for me to do that. But I decided to give it a try just because I was really more curious about Capterra.com and how it worked. Anyway, long story short, I found 3 or 4 software packages that I use on a regular basis, and I just kind of randomly did a review, told them what I thought. Well, believe it or not, as a result of that, one of those companies actually contacted me because one of the comments I made was, a little bit on the negative side. It was an aspect of the software that I wasn't happy with. And anyway, they reached out to me and to see if there's any way that they could help. And then they actually gave me a discount code to upgrade to the latest version of their software because it fixes the thing that I was complaining about. So anyway, perfect example of social media and how companies being active on social media can increase their social capital. There is a risk, though. There is the risk of excessively critical feedback. All right, so when you are using social networks, there are ways to increase the strength of the relationship. So we talked about the fact that relationship is part of what can increase the social capital. So you can, ask clients or people to do you a favor. You can have more frequent interactions, and you can connect to those that have more assets. So connecting to people, if you think of on Facebook, connecting to someone that has lots of friends, or on LinkedIn, connecting to someone that has lots of contacts immediately increases your social network. And so the definition of social capital here is the number of relationships times the strength of those relationships times the entity resources that they have. So that's kind of the official definition of that. So we talked a little bit about risks and how do you manage that risk? Well, certainly all companies should have a social media policy. If they don't, that's probably something that you're going to see more and more of. And it really is a statement that discusses the employee's rights and responsibilities on social media. The more technical the organization, typically the more open and lenient their social policies are, but that really depends. So, a lot of you may, your current company may have asked you to sign a social media policy. All right, and so what about the risk of user-generated content? So you think about if you have a Facebook page or the review that I was talking about that I did on Capterra.com. On Capterra, I know that the review has to be reviewed first. So someone from Capterra looks at that review, probably to make sure people aren't just, slandering a company or maybe using inappropriate language. But someone has to monitor that, for the inappropriate comment, the unfavorable reviews. But on Capterra.com, it actually asks you to state one of the weaknesses of the software. So they actually are specifically asking you to state something unfavorable. But my guess is if a company's Facebook page or something like that, they're probably monitoring that for unfavorable comments. So you really have to decide if you are going to have a social media presence, the company really has to decide how you're going to deal with the problematic content. Are you going to leave it? Are you going to respond to it? Are you going to let the community respond to it? If you're going to delete it, what do you want to do with it? There isn't a right or wrong answer necessarily, but it is a decision that a company has to make. The comment here, never wrestle with a pig because you'll get dirty and the pig will enjoy it. Meaning that, if someone leaves a negative comment, it's a very slippery slope because they're just wanting to fuel it. They really probably just want you to respond, and you'll probably never really win them over. So it's a pretty challenging thing to deal with. Your homework assignment for this week is on social marketing and ethics. So a couple of things to think about is, how is social networking different in business than in private life? So my guess is that most of you have a Facebook page. I'll use myself as an example. So I have a Facebook page, although I'm not a very frequent poster of it. I mainly have Facebook to keep track of my kids, although younger kids now don't even get on Facebook. But I also have a LinkedIn page. And I think of my LinkedIn as more my professional network and Facebook more my personal network. So I have a personal policy on Facebook that I don't connect with anyone in my professional life. There's probably a few rare exceptions, but I don't network or friend people that are not, family or friends. But then on LinkedIn, that's my professional network, and so I'll connect to lots of different people there. The posts that I make on LinkedIn are all very professional posts. Now, if I were to post on Facebook, I don't very often, but if I did, it would probably be more personal type things like, I don't know, what, my family did over the summer, or more personal things like that, maybe things about my kids. So, things to think about. Do you think the ethics vary between private and business use of social networking? And how do you mesh those two together? Certainly, I'll tell you that my opinion of keeping, Facebook personal and LinkedIn professional, not everyone would agree with that. A lot of people would disagree with that, and they handle that very differently. And so as an employer, you do need to think about, what your employees are potentially posting that, other people at the company might see, that clients might see. It's a pretty tricky situation. And your homework assignment is about how social media potentially can be used in the hiring process. Because obviously employees are sharing personal information on social networks. The lines become blurred. We talked about that. Work is portable and always on. I mean, I work, a good part of my day in the evening at home. My laptop's always on. My phone's always on. So it's hard to mesh. It's hard to make the distinction between personal and business life now, because they're all kind of meshed together. So you do have to be careful about what you say, definitely. And I believe that was the last slide. All right, thank you.